kind of civilizations build starships? So we ask the question, and it implies that there are kinds of civilizations. We don't have to necessarily agree with that. We might hold that civilization is one kind of thing and one kind of thing only, and only we can mark developmental stages that admit of periodization, but I'm going to at least argue that there are kinds of civilizations. And if there are kinds of civilizations, we should be able to formulate a taxonomy of civilizations. If we can formulate a taxonomy of civilizations, we should be able to classify our civilization. If we classify civilizations, some subset of civilizations will be spacefaring, and among the spacefaring civilization, a further subset might or will build starships. So does our civilization fall into the classification of those civilizations that converge upon building starships? And if we are a civilization likely to go on to build starships, is there any way to accelerate this development? If we are not a civilization likely to converge upon spacefaring and starships, could the developmental direction of our civilization be changed? And if so, how? So to try to answer these questions, we need to try to think scientifically about civilization. So, how do we think scientifically about civilization? I am going to start with Rudolf Carnap, who was an early 20th century analytical philosopher, made a tripartite distinction between scientific concepts of the taxonomic, the comparative, and the quantitative. And Carnap saw these as largely a sequence of development where we start with taxonomic concepts, classification, we move on to comparative concepts, and finally when we reach a mature stage of the science, we can move on to quantitative concepts. So to give you a flavor of what Carnap was aiming at, I'm going to quote a paragraph from his Philosophical Foundations of Physics. A scientist often says it would certainly be desirable to introduce quantitative concepts that can be measured on a scale into my field. Unfortunately, this cannot be done yet. The field is only in its infancy. We have not yet developed techniques for measurement, so we have to restrict ourselves to a non-quantitative, qualitative language. Perhaps in the future, when the field is more advanced, we will be able to develop a quantitative language. The scientist might be right in making the statement, but he is in error if he concludes that, since he has to talk in qualitative terms, he must confine his language to classificatory concepts. It is often the case that before quantitative concepts can be introduced into a field of science, they are preceded by comparative concepts that are much more effective tools for describing, predicting, and explaining than the cruder classificatory concepts. So the most famous taxonomy that any of us would be aware of, or most of us would be aware of, I should say, is the Linnaean taxonomy of botany, which was then gradually expanded to the whole of the biological kingdom. But when Linnaeus worked out his classification of botany, biology had been around the earth for more than 3 billion years. So he's working from a very mature base of information, mature ecosystems. There was a lot of information and a very rich base of instances to classify. And we're not really in that position with civilization. We could wait 1 billion years and see what happens with civilization and then return to the problem after we could see its development, but obviously we're impatient to do something before that time. And it seems almost that with civilization, we jump directly into quantitative concepts while bypassing the classificatory and comparative concepts that Carnap thought came earlier in the exposition. We're all familiar and all have heard about Kardashov's civilization types, where he differentiated civilization based on their energy usage. This has become very commonplace in the interstellar community, and people talk about the future of civilization. It's become so commonplace that I frequently carry around with me a copy of Kardashov's 1964 paper because of the ways that people misquote and attribute things to him that he never said. Carl Sagan also developed a quantification of civilization based on information processing. He started with a society that could process 10 to the 6 bits of information, called that type A, called it extremely primitive, and went up 1 order of magnitude for every letter of the alphabet, characterizing Periclean Athens as type E, our civilization today as type H, type Q, a galactic civilization of 1 million worlds, each characterized by 1,000 times the information content of our terrestrial civilization, and type Z, 1 billion such federated galaxies with all the information held collectively. So, Why is there a problem with this jumping into quantitative concepts? Kardashev and Sagan introduced bridge principles to relate existing science to folk concepts of civilization, but they did not introduce any internal principles of a theory of civilization. So that's a mouthful, and what does it mean? So I'm going to refer to another early 20th century analytical philosopher, the contemporary of Carnap, who also made the distinction among scientific concepts between the classificatory, the comparative, and the quantitative. Hempel also made a distinction between the internal principles of theory and the bridge principles of a theory. The internal principles of a theory are couched in its characteristic theoretical terms, but if you want to test a theory, you have to test it against antecedently available or pre-theoretical terms, and to establish a relationship between internal principles of a theory and antecedently available terms, you need to introduce bridge principles, so there's some kind of a systematic relationship between the two sets of concepts. So the need to bridge the gap. Folk concepts. Dan Dennett introduced the idea of folk concepts when he taught, I think in the book The Intentional Stance, but he uses it throughout his work when he talked about folk psychology. Folk psychology is the language we use to talk about the mind before we actually have a theory of mind. And others have taken up Dennett's idea and talked about folk physics and folk biology, and I've mentioned folk astrophysics even. So these are antecedently available pre-theoretical terms, but in the extant quantitative concepts of civilization, like in Sagan and Kardashev that I cited, we don't have any internal principles for a theory of civilization. And if we want to relate the folk concepts, we need bridge principles. So what do I mean by folk concepts of civilization? Very often in the writings of archaeologists, you find terms like agrarian civilization and hydrological civilization, the latter being using irrigation usually. Very often discussions of SETI, you find technological civilization or advanced technological civilization. Toynbee, the historian, talked about fossil civilizations, arrested civilizations, and abortive civilizations. So I'm saying that these are folk concepts of civilization that lack a theoretical framework. So we come back to if we want to try to start at the base and not jump ahead to quantitative conceptions of civilization that don't have internal principles, we're back to classificatory thought, classificatory concepts that are qualitative thought and hopefully a taxonomy based on non-superficial characteristics, comparative thought that establish what has been called a non-metrical order, that is an order of ranking that doesn't involve numerical values, and quantitative thought that involves precise measurements and numerical values. So since I've mentioned Linnaean taxonomy and some quantitative conceptions, just as a side note, I want to mention what might be a comparative conception of civilization, which I call the peer concept. We can compare civilizations based on whether they're at the same level of development approximately or the same kind of civilization. So two civilizations at the same level of development and of the same kind are peers. If they're just a little offset in development or in kind, then they're near peers. If they're both recognized in these civilizations, but they're not really close, then I call them non-peers. So I just said I wanted to mention that. I'm not going to go into that. I could spend the whole lecture on that today, but I'm not going to, except to mention very briefly that insofar as we think of the Starship as a technological achievement, and I will of course note in Dr. Armstrong's presentation yesterday, she suggested reasons we might want to pass beyond the paradigm of considering the Starship as an exclusively technological achievement. When we ask the question, we're already thinking in terms of peer civilizations when we're thinking about other civilizations that build starships. It's going to be something like ourselves, a civilization more or less the same kind as our civilization. So if we want to try to attempt to establish a taxonomy of civilization, we are faced with unique problems. Of course, every discipline has its unique problems of classification. When Linnaeus proposed his taxonomy of plants, it was essentialist in character and highly structural. He believed all species were individually created and eternal and didn't change. And since that time, the whole field has been changed by evolutionary biology. And there's still in the writings of biology, there's a tension between the surviving Linnaean taxonomy and a completely thoroughgoing evolutionary taxonomy that just appeals to relations of common descent and not to structural similarity. Structural similarities are there as homologies, but they're not what defines it. It's the relations of descent that defines it. So with life on Earth, you can do that. We know from DNA that all life on Earth shares the same core code of DNA. And when we get out into space and are able to look at life elsewhere, if we can find it in the moons in the oceans of Europa, or maybe in the subsurface of Mars, the first things biologists will want to do is look at that DNA, if it's structured on DNA, and see if it's like our DNA, and see if we can extend the common descent thesis out into space and how far we can do so. That's an unknown, but hopefully we'll learn that in the next few decades. But the common descent thesis does not apply to civilization. We know that civilization has arisen separately at least 5 times in a fundamentally different way on the Earth. There's the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Valley, Fertile Crescent, the Rio Balsas Valley in southern Mexico, and in Peru. So we're back to Linnaean attempt to classify according to non-superficial characteristics. So I'm going to call this Darwin's thesis on civilization, that civilizations don't have a common descent. As he wrote in The Descent of Man, the evidence that all civilized nations are the descendant of barbarians consists, on the one side, of clear traces of their former low condition and still existing customs, belief, language, and so on, and on the other side, of proofs that savages are independently able to raise themselves a few steps in the scale of civilization and actually have thus risen. When Darwin said this more than 150 years ago, it was a controversial idea. So there was a very common assumption in the past that the farther you go in the past, the closer you get to the source and origin of things, the closer to the truth you get. And our world today is a degraded and fallen version of the world of the past, which was always better. So science has completely abandoned that assumption, and we assume that civilizations started in their widely dispersed geographical locations without much interaction with others. The classification of kinds of civilizations related to the problem of defining the class of all civilizations. So how do we do that? What is a civilization? So I'm going to start with just the basic framework of what's sometimes called a recursive definition. X is a civilization if X has F, X has G, X has H, so on for some limited finite set of properties. And if you add the extremal clause and nothing else is a civilization, then you close it off, or if you leave that off, you have an open textured concept. So what finite list of properties would we want to use to define civilization? On the one side here, I'll taken a list from archaeologist Susan Foster McCarter. This is a very familiar list to most archaeologists. It ultimately derives from the work of V. Gordon Childe, who was a great prehistorian. Writing, social hierarchy, division of labor, formalized government, means of exchange, monumental architecture, formalized religion, and metallurgy. And for something very different, this is from Kenneth Clark's Civilization, A Personal View, where he defines civilization in terms of a confidence in the society in which one lives, belief in its laws, belief in its philosophy, vigor, energy, vitality, etc., and so forth. A list that no archaeologist and very few historians would assert today. But they both have a certain point. Quote from V. Gordon Childe, the development of urban civilization can be traced continuously till the moment when the full light of written history draws upon it and within it. The story is one of accumulating wealth, improving technical skill, of increasing specialization of labor, and of expanding trade. These are all kinds of things you can dig traces out of the ground if you're an archaeologist. So if you're an archaeologist, that's the kind of conception of civilization you're going to be pretty interested in. And here, a very different thing, once again from Kenneth Clark. That's a picture of the Greenwich Naval Hospital designed by Christopher Wren. And he says, what is civilization? A state of mind where it is thought desirable for a naval hospital to look like this and for the inmates to dine in a splendidly decorated hall. So when I was thinking about what we may call the material constituents of civilization and the formal constituents of civilization, I realized I'd seen this distinction before, and it's a very familiar distinction in Marx, the distinction between the economic infrastructure of a society and its ideological superstructure. Marx also calls the economic infrastructure the economic base of a society. So here's one quote from a contribution to the critique of political economy. Relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures. And the same idea in a slightly different form from the German ideology, social organization evolving directly out of production and commerce, which in all ages forms the basis of the state and the rest of the idealistic superstructure. So, drawing on this Marxian distinction between infrastructure and superstructure, we can create a binomial nomenclature for civilization. And I put on the left here economic infrastructure, on the right potential intellectual superstructures, talking about what I call biocentric civilizations, agriculturalism, settled peoples who till the soil and control the reproduction of both the plants and animals, pastoral people who are usually nomadic and raise animals on the hoof, or sometimes completely nomadic and sometimes according to the going to summer movement between summer and winter pastures, which is called transhumance. Fishing, tribute. Rome mostly lived on tribute during its heyday. Trade and commerce. Venice, Serenissima, the Serene Republic. They didn't do much agriculture, but they were very wealthy from trade and commerce. When we pass on to technocentric civilizations, economic infrastructure is primarily industry, trade and commerce, and even administration and organization. And intellectual superstructures, of course, we're all familiar with mythological ideas, political ideologies, religious ideologies, manifest destinies, and the like that shape the intellectual superstructures of these economic bases. So the basic Marxian theory that everyone has heard is that economic infrastructure determines the superstructure. But we don't have to follow Marx on this. We can develop a more comprehensive scheme where we might recognize that there are cases when intellectual superstructure determines economic infrastructure. For example, the medieval European prohibition on interest. The church forbade Christians to lend money to other Christians at interest. And so you have a whole civilization that has chosen to self-sabotage its financial structure in the name of its intellectual superstructure. And the most obvious case of all, when you have infrastructure and superstructure that mutually shape each other, so that economics influences the intellectual life of its people and intellectual life influences its economy. So in simplest terms, economic infrastructure, the ways and means of large-scale social organization, and the intellectual superstructure, the ends and aims of large-scale social organization, and some kind of interaction between the two. It might take many different forms. So, going back to my framework of a recursive definition and then drawing on this Marxian distinction, I could say that X is a civilization if X has an economic infrastructure, X has an intellectual superstructure, and these infrastructure and superstructure stand in some relationship to each other of the three kinds that we mentioned, and adding the extremal clause, nothing else is a civilization. So, a society or a culture that doesn't have an economic superstructure or doesn't have an intellectual superstructure, the two aren't systematically in relationship, I'm going to say that's not a civilization. So this is not something that's common. I don't know of anybody else who has said this, so this is not something you'll run into elsewhere. But this is a trial definition of how we might establish a binomial nomenclature of civilization. So some human civilizations to date. Those of you who have read some of my posts maybe on Centauri dreams and know that I have a typical vocabulary that when I talk about civilizations, and I use the term agrarian ecclesiastical civilization for civilization before the Industrial Revolution. The economy is primarily agrarian. More than 90% of the people are peasants, illiterate, toiling on the land, and the ideological infrastructure is ecclesiastical, religious in nature. And if the farther back you go in time, if you take ancient Egypt as an example, you've got essentially a realized utopia with people worshiping a living god. When they see the Pharaoh isn't just a king, he's a living god. It's a completely theocentric civilization. So that's pretty familiar. The terminology is different, but that idea is familiar. This is not so familiar. There's another class of civilizations I call pastoral egalitarian civilizations. So let me pause for a moment and read this quote from Cynthia Stokes-Brown. Cynthia Stokes-Brown is well known in the big history community. Serious students of archaeology, anthropology, and history use a technical definition of civilization that describes without conveying value judgments. Civilization in this technical sense are a specific type of human community, large, complex societies based on the domestication of plants, animals, and people, plus other typical characteristics. You find things like this all over in writings on archaeology and history these days, but I don't really think that people do justice to this, because we still today think of the horse peoples of Central Asia as being barbarians. So we don't use the word much, we don't use the word much anymore, but the peoples of, the horse peoples of Central Asia were very successful, very highly organized, but completely organized on different principles than agrarian ecclesiastical civilization. Their economy was pastoral. We all know Attila the Hun, the Mongols, and later Tamerlane. They didn't usually build cities. They didn't build monumental architecture. Many of them had no written language, but they were highly effective. And if we take, for example, as a comparative conception of civilization, warfare, we can establish a non-metrical order among civilizations on the basis of who can defeat whom in war. And during the late medieval, early modern period, the pastoral egalitarian horse peoples of Central Asia could field an army that could defeat any army of any settled peoples in Eurasia, and they often did. And Tamerlane, who was among the last of the horse people conquerors, the depredations of his army can only be compared to a pandemic. It's estimated that Tamerlane's army was responsible for the death of about 3% of global population at the time. So another classification that you don't hear about, I'm going to call furtive egalitarian. Furtive means relating to theft, and I'm talking about the Vikings, who made their living by raiding and trading. Yes, they had small farms along fjords in Norway, but the center of their civilization was the voyaging and the raiding and the trading, and they were intensely egalitarian in their structure. Once again, you don't find much monumental architecture. You don't find a written language until much later, but in my opinion, a civilization, because you find an economic infrastructure, not agriculture, but theft, basically, and you find a very rich ideological infrastructure people are borrowing off of. And lastly, our industrial technological civilization of today. The economic basis is industrial. When I say technological, I mean that the principles of organization of the society or the civilization are technical. People are primarily concerned in practical ways of getting things done. The Chinese call themselves communists, but we all know that the Chinese government is run by technocrats who just want to see things get done. They don't really care much about ideology. Of course, Deng Xiaoping famously said, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. That's the essence of technocratic organization of an industrial economy. So if we extrapolate this idea of an economic infrastructure into the future, and we assume that scientific civilization is primarily constituted by its energy production distribution, we can outline certain possibilities. And firstly, I'll talk about fusion civilization. A civilization that has mastered inertial confinement fusion can build starships, can build the Daedalus craft. It could also build fusion reactors and supply energy to a large industrial infrastructure. Similarly, a Bussard civilization, a civilization that has mastered magnetic confinement fusion. You can build a starship, but you can also supply your entire industrial economy with relatively clean power in just about any amount you want. O'Neill civilization, we've all seen the great pictures of the O'Neill colonies, the idea. The interesting thing about O'Neill's writings is he really wanted to show an economic infrastructure of the whole effort. He knew that if you're going to engage in a large spacefaring effort, it has to have an economic rationale. Its economic rationale was building solar power satellites that would beam electricity down to Earth, and that would justify the cost of the investment. Dyson civilizations, which are essentially a build-out of O'Neill civilizations, where you got so many things orbiting the sun that you harvest almost all of its starlight. And of course, the poetic version of that is actually building a shell around the whole thing and harvesting all the starlight that way. And Penrose civilizations, even more difficult and complex and presumably farther in the future, harvesting the angular momentum, energy from angular momentum from rotating black holes. So, several different possible economic infrastructures for spacefaring civilizations or future civilizations. So we can extrapolate this infrastructure, superstructure conception of scientific civilizations and pick any one on the left and pick any one on the right, and you've got all kinds of possible permutations of future civilizations based on the binomial nomenclature I've been talking about. So, starting with the earliest origins of civilization, proto-civilization during the period of hunter-gatherer nomadism. So now we move from a structural Linnaean type of taxonomy to an evolutionary systematic sort of taxonomy. And from the origins of civilization, we see two major directions: agrarian ecclesiastical settled civilization and pastoral egalitarian civilization, which is quite potent for a while, but it ultimately goes extinct. The agriculturalists proved more effective in the long term, and basically they took up all the land and eventually fenced it and put borders in, and you couldn't have tens of thousands of horses on the plains of Central Asia anymore. And from agrarian ecclesiastical settled civilization, then we get our industrial technological civilization, which we can distinguish into a non-spacefaring version and a spacefaring version. And of course, the non-spacefaring version goes extinct eventually. If you're not familiar with that symbol, that's a fairly recent symbol that means extinction, one that looks like the hourglass there. And then we go on to spacefaring civilizations, and I'm going to pause for a while before going on to more about spacefaring civilizations to talk about our civilization today, which I call industrial technological civilization, which falls under the genera of scientific civilizations. I argue that industrial technological civilization is uniquely determined by a feedback cycle that I call the STEM cycle. Everybody knows what STEM means. In our civilization today, science discovers bodies of knowledge, some of which can be adapted to technologies. Technologies are engineered into industries. Industries create better instruments for science, and better instruments for science mean new technological discoveries that can drive the cycle even further. It's not that neat in actual practice. There's epiphenomenal science that may be edifying, but it doesn't necessarily drive directly into technology. There's a lot of technologies that never enter into mass productions. And there's a lot of engineering that doesn't contribute to scientific progress. So it can be messy, but it's still there. Civilization has always been characterized by some kind of a STEM cycle. What's distinctive about ours today is it's tightly coupled. In a loosely coupled STEM cycle, and you see in earlier civilization, you've got sometimes hundreds or thousands of years lapsed between a scientific discovery and its technological implementation. When Apollonius wrote his book on conic sections in ancient Greece, it was 1,000 years before people started to use that to aim artillery pieces during the early modern period, when people realized that projectiles travel on a parabola and not a straight line. And technology is often not engineered into industries, and industries do not always provide new scientific instruments. So, and a further minor distinction I'll make here. Agrarian ecclesiastical civilization in its purest form, we see up to about the scientific revolution. And then there's a period that I sometimes call modernism without industrialism. We've got the scientific revolution, and then with the Industrial Revolution, industrial technological civilization proper. During the period of modernism without industrialism, you've got scientific knowledge entering into the intellectual superstructure of civilization, but the life of ordinary people is almost untouched. Whereas in industrial civilization, the life of people is transformed when science enters into the economic infrastructure of the civilization. Whereas in the past, more than 90% of a given civilization were illiterate peasants working the land. Now, more than 90% of people are wage or salary workers, but almost everyone's an employee. So the failure of the STEM cycle, if I'm right that the STEM cycle uniquely determines industrial technological civilization, the failure of the STEM cycle, whether from stalled technologies, unintended consequences of engineering, or science experience and model crisis, does not mean a stagnant industrial technological civilization. It means that something else emerges from that. So, and that is an argument that cuts two ways. As if the cycle becomes decoupled, you get a new kind of civilization that, because the condition that defines industrial technological civilization no longer holds, and something else emerges. If the cycle continues, then you get new science, you get new technology, and new engineering. So you don't know what those are going to be, but you can't say, well, it's just going to keep on going like it's going, but we're not going to have dramatic new technologies or new scientific discoveries. It's going to happen if we have the same kind of civilization. So it seems clear that it has to be industrial technological civilization that builds starships in the sense of a technological artifact mentioned earlier. Because only in those kind of civilizations do you find the kind of continual technological change that make it possible to achieve the kind of technology that would be necessary for interstellar flight. So if we want to think about what we could do to stage a spacefaring intervention for a faltering civilization, or one that doesn't seem to be going in the direction of space flight, the first stage is a conscious maintenance of the STEM cycle, consciously pushing the frontiers of science and mathematics, purposefully seeking new technologies within new sciences, and systematically exploiting new technologies and industrial applications, then in turn applying these new technologies to increase scientific discoveries. But the development of starships and the civilization that builds them is far from inevitable, because a civilization can be perfectly consistent with the development of spacefaring or starfaring without ever bothering to actualize that possible capacity. So to return to my evolutionary diagram of the descent of civilizations, once again showing non-spacefaring industrialized technology civilization going extinct when the Earth becomes uninhabitable, we can take this down another level, and we can distinguish between spacefaring civilizations that do not develop interstellar technologies and spacefaring civilizations that do develop interstellar technologies. And of course, the ones that don't have interstellar technologies, they go extinct too, eventually, with the uninhabitability of our solar system. So we come down to the spacefaring civilizations that do develop interstellar technologies, and we wonder what kinds of civilization, what kinds of interstellar civilization are there? How can we construct some kind of a taxonomy? And so I asked myself, how do civilizations interact across space? How might they interact across interstellar space? So this is an artificial, simplified model. It doesn't capture all the details, but it's suggestive in terms of the possibilities it suggests. So communication, that's obvious. Carriage, that means the transportation of goods and freight, over interstellar distances, and actual contact. So I'm using these terms in a specifically narrow sense when I use it. So when I say contact, I don't mean communication. I mean actually getting living beings together over interstellar distances and meeting other human beings or other species. And if we take these three categories of civilizational interaction and we go through them systematically, we get 8 permutations of interstellar civilizations, which I will show here. I'm going to go through this list quickly because I'll treat each one of these separately. And I'd like to mention a Particular thank you to Michel Lemontagne, who did the 8 illustrations for me just a few days before the Congress. So it was great of him that he stepped up and was able to make my presentation more visually interesting. So, C sub 0, I call this the lonely civilization. That's us now. No communication, no carriage, no interstellar contact. That's pretty simple. C sub 1, communication, no carriage, no contact. That's the SETI paradigm. But you can still have a very interesting interaction, and we all know about Carl Sagan talking about the Encyclopedia Galactica, the idea that there are radio signals traveling back and forth, and a grand encyclopedia of all information about the universe that you share in when you reach the point that you can enter into that communications network. So you've got a real interstellar civilization. It just doesn't involve carriage of goods and freight, or it doesn't involve direct contact between the parties. So I call that the SETI paradigm. C sub 2, no communication, no contact, but carriage. I call this the mercantile paradigm. Seems a little odd, but think of Bracewell probes. Ronald Bracewell suggested that instead of doing SETI by transmitting signals from Earth, we could build a probe with all the information we wanted to transmit, send it to another solar system, and that would be a more efficient way of engaging in interaction, and that would be one kind, not the only kind. That would be one kind you might see carriage between solar star systems without direct contact and without communication. C sub 1, 2, communication and carriage with no contact. I call this the Silk Road paradigm. If you think of the Silk Road during the Middle Ages, the people at each end of that road, the people in China and the people, say, in the European Mediterranean basin, there was a small trickle of luxury goods, so there was a little bit of freight between the two, and there was communication because books traveled along the Silk Road, but the peoples on the opposite end never met each other. Yes, the trailers along the way met each other, but it is one way of thinking about this particular paradigm. And it can be very powerful. One of the most interesting episodes in human civilization, in my opinion, is was the expansion of Buddhism along the Silk Road. The enormous monumental architecture of the Bamiyan Buddhas that were destroyed by the Taliban showed how powerful Buddhism was in Central Asia during the period of late antiquity, before Christianity had spread that far and before Islam had even appeared. The missionary paradigm, C sub 1 and 3, with no carriage. Sometimes people communicate and they contact, but they don't carry a whole lot of goods with them. So, imagine we could build Alcubierre starships that would transport people from place to place, but they weren't really good at carrying. There's no real reason to carry stuff interstellar distances. Anywhere, once you've got the technology, any star system you go is going to have energy, it's going to have material resources, you can build everything you need. You don't really need to carry things, unless maybe a small trickle of luxury trade like the Silk Road. Contact, without communication, without carriage. The close encounters paradigm, that should be fairly self-explanatory, as is the illustration here. The silent barter paradigm, C sub 2, 3, carriage and contact without communication. In the past, when peoples could not communicate with each other, they still did trade, and they still engaged in contact. There's what we call silent barter, is where one party would lay out their goods on the ground and then go away. The other party would come and lay theirs, and the first party would come back, and if they were satisfied with the trade, they took the trade goods, and if not, they left them there. So, another possibility. And then the whole shebang, fully integrated civilization where you've got communication, carriage, and contact. So this is just a rough attempt to model some unrealized possibilities. Some of the permutations sound strange, but like I say, this is a simplified and abstract model that's just intended to spur thinking. None of the permutations I mentioned are inevitable. The permutations are probably a function of contingencies that are not yet determined. Among those contingencies are the particular kinds of interstellar technologies that prove to be practicable. We may get to the point where we have many different interstellar technologies, but they might not be equally useful, equally practicable. Maybe you can generate a wormhole, but you can't do anything with it. Or maybe you can make an Alcubierre field, but you can't do anything with it. We don't know yet what technologies will actually be practical as opposed to those will be possible. At this stage, we don't even know which ones will be possible. And some of the contingencies may be turned out to be a function of the kind of civilization. So if a civilization follows a very different pathway to industrialization and development, it might have different potentialities for making a practicable technology. Another unrealized possibility. So whenever I consider possible scenarios for civilization like this, I ask myself, is this what we are becoming? Do we see traces in the world today of the direction we're going? Well, that's not always going to be answerable. Sometimes things come out of the clear blue, but things don't always or even often come out of the clear blue. So, you know, if you're not building out spacefaring infrastructure, you're not really becoming a spacefaring civilization. And if you're not building out a interstellar infrastructure, you're not really becoming an interstellar civilization, because the ships that cross the Atlantic, and were able to do that in the time of the contact between the Old World and New World, there was a large shipbuilding industry in Europe, and the Portuguese navigators had already gone down around the Horn of Africa, and so there was a lot of exploring going on that set the stage to make that possible. So there was an infrastructure build out of shipping in Western Europe that made the transatlantic crossings possible. So I want to propose what I would call the breakout thesis, which is that any interstellar civilization whatsoever that achieves interstellar breakout will only occur after an infrastructure build out makes that breakout possible. And that would seem to privilege the side of the binomial nomenclature that I've talked about, called the economic infrastructure. But there's still another important lesson here. If we use the often cited example of building of the Egyptian pyramids, which were a very large multi-generational undertaking, if we compare that to the building of starships, another large multi-generational undertaking, the actual artifacts are epiphenomenal to the civilizational project. Why did the Egyptians build pyramids? They built them because of their particular beliefs about the afterlife, and that this is how the monumental architecture they used to signify their rulers and to assure them a passage to the next world. And presumably, why would we build starships? Because of a scientific paradigm of similar power that would motivate people to do that. So, the question I started with, what kind of civilizations build starships? And my answer to that is industrial technological civilizations tightly coupled to an interstellar imperative embodied in an intellectual superstructure. So, thank you very much, and I hope that wasn't too much to throw at you in one time.